Hey, what's good, everybody? Welcome to episode 3.1 of my Bitwig review. Today we're going to be covering all of the effects as far as audio manipulation, and we have quite a bit to talk about. So the way that I think that I'm going to go about this, because I thought about doing separate videos and stuff, is I'm just going to kind of use a simple saw wave and throw these effects on here and briefly give a description about each one. I have a feeling that this video is going to be relatively lengthy, but we're basically going to go in alphabetical order, and I'll kind of talk about all of the audio effects that are within this, and then I can give you a brief overview. And if I catch anything along the way that seems relatively interesting, then I'll give you guys a brief description of that, but we're not going to waste any more time, and here we go. So first off, we have an amp, and it's basically a distortion unit that has two stages. On the first one, you have your input EQ, to which you can kind of shape how you want that to sound like. And you can use these three bands to kind of manipulate that. You also have a drive, sag, which I'm not sure what that means, and then also a bias of whether it goes from the low or high. You have all these resonances that you can affect, and then you also have 8 different distortion types that you can choose from. Once you get to the output EQ of this one, it's kind of actually the same thing, except we have a cabinet feature now. But the same algorithms from class A, XYZ are the same here, and then you can kind of mix and go as you please. One cool feature that I like about this is that you can change the cabinet size, and you can even automate that as you wish, and then you can change between stereo, mono, and then you also have pre-effects and post-effects to send through. The audio receiver is pretty straightforward. This is great if you want to do some kind of envelope follower and you want something to affect this. So you basically choose an input source and have something select that. So if you have something that you want to do like a sidechain to, or you have something that you want to activate like a filter, then you would basically set this up and kind of connect it to the audio source as a container. The bit 8 function is actually a pretty awesome, it is a distortion, but more so it's a bit crusher in some ways. And so we have a clock speed, which basically is the quality of the kilohertz. So think of this as like your downsample. Jitter adds a little bit of randomness, and the chance is, I guess, the chance of the jitter for this to move. I don't really use that much. You have a gate right here, which is basically at whatever decibel or whatever threshold you choose. Sounds pretty good. And then you also have some shaper options, which is actually pretty cool. Over on the quantize, I'm not exactly sure what the quantize does, but I find that myself, I like to use the diffusion on things. You also have a brightness and quantization and square domain setting, which can make that louder. Next up, we have blur. This is a really cool diffusion delay. I'm a big fan of Replica XT because it has something that's just like this, but Bitwig has its own built-in effects system. And so basically you have 2 different delays that you set the time and space to, and this kind of just creates these awesome drone effects that you can use to manipulate space. And so basically here you have your feedback. Careful, because I guess I can get a little bit crazy. And then you also have your time and all that stuff. And so automating some of this stuff can get you some pretty interesting results. I typically just kind of throw it on, and then I send a reverb through it, and it makes a nice little spacious atmosphere for you. So the chain is great because you basically can set up multiple things and you can add a mix. So if you want to have like a list of effects and have it kind of within this container, which is a little bit different, but just pretend like they're the same thing for now, then you can set this and then actually have a dry wet. And so like, let's say you have a filter or something that you want to automate the mix on, you can throw it within a chain and then basically do that. And it's cool too, because this is what you would typically use. Not that you have to, but it's a great way to kind of mess with individual mixes within having multiple chains if you like doing signal splitting of some sort. The chorus is actually pretty nice. I would have liked this to be a high pass instead of a low pass, but I think that it actually sounds pretty good. And you can set this to wide, give it some nice stereo effects, and I like the visualization. I'm big on visuals. The phase offset is kind of neat. That's not really something that you see a lot, so you can kind of just offset that in such a way. And then you also have 2 different algorithms to choose from. So it's a nice little subtle chorus that I think is really cool when you combine that with a phaser and stuff. The comb filter is kind of typical. You have your hertz settings, then you have your feedback, so it acts as an XY pad. So it's kind of cool that it's set in this way that you can kind of mess around with this. Holy cow. That would be really cool to visit with some detuning. But I like that you can have the negative feedback on that. It's not unique, but obviously it can give you some super interesting results if used well. So the compressor is interesting because this isn't what you would typically use for your sidechain input. You would actually use dynamics, but it's not to say that you can't. You can actually go in here and then go into audio sidechain. And so you have this set up as this, but it's kind of backwards because you might as well just use a tool, but it's not to say you can't do it, just letting you know. But other than that, it's pretty typical as a compressor. You have your input gain, your threshold ratio, attack and release, and then your output, and then you also have your makeup. Sorry, I wish that this was a glue compressor. So it's great, but there's just no beating that, especially with things that offer things like soft clip. DC offset is just for correction. It will kind of tell you if you have a signal here or whatnot, and then you can use this to kind of correct if you want to. If you don't know about DC offset, just Google it. It more so has to do with the idea of phase offset and stuff and getting everything lined up correctly. But next up, we have a de-esser. So if you need to kind of chop off the top end or something, and you can kind of do that. Oh, wait. Oh, that's kind of cool that you can. This is like the one thing that I found that you can use to monitor the input signal of, so that's actually pretty neat. But you have two high pass filter types, like you have the cutoff frequency, and then you can basically choose how much you want to do that. I can't actually get myself to get my mic recording in this for some reason, which I'll talk about in a different video, but if you want to basically see how that's working, you can see that that's cutting off there, and again, that's just chopping off the tops, but the reason why this isn't making a difference is because I don't really have any high harmonics in this. De-esser is kind of nice. So next up we have our delays, and I'll kind of just keep this window open. But the delays is pretty standard. You have actually quite a few options to choose from, and you also have an offset, which is pretty nice. So it's cool that you have the ability to choose between the numbers and then do an offset. You also have think of it as like a band pass EQ of some sort, or a low and a high feedback. In this, you also have feedback effects that you can throw this into, and then if you want to change this to time and do crazy stuff like that, then that's always available too. So the delay 2 and the delay 4 are all pretty similar in some ways. You basically have two of these, but you have this crossfeed function between the left and right now, which is kind of neat. So if you want to do like an offset of these, then it creates a nice full space, and then you can also detune them. And now this is in some way or another a kind of super saw of sorts. The rate will introduce some kind of vibrato, though it's not that noticeable. It's kind of subtle. If you're in headphones, you can tell. Then of course you have your high and low cutoff, and then your width, and then your mix, which is kind of cool actually. So think about that, and then the delay 4 is just kind of like a super duper super delay thing, but it's kind of cool because you can send the feedback of each one of these into themselves. So you can take the feedback from 1 and send that into 2, and then you can send that into 3 and send that into 4, and I think that everything is kind of cut off right now, yeah. But if you turn all these up, then I gotta do that before it goes crazy. But as you can see, you get some really neat things. And one cool thing about this too is that each feedback or each delay section has both pre and post effects. So this is actually a really interesting sound design tool if you know how to use it right. And I'll be honest, I haven't really dove that far into it, but just know that those options exist, and there are some crazy options that you can do within trying to just make some interesting sounds. So that's definitely something I'll be covering more in the future. So the distortion unit is kind of interesting because it's nice that you have this band to choose from, and so basically it will take anything that's within the blue and red margin. And I'm pretty sure that this is actually an overdrive of some sort, so you can basically use this to kind of, if you want to introduce some more high end, you kind of can make sure that all of these are turned up. And I think the slew, yeah, is kind of the dictator of that. So you can make this as bright or as dark as you want it to be. Definitely a lot of effect with that, but I would probably go in and turn the width down. but this could be something that's kind of fun to automate with crossovers and all that to have a bit of fun with. But this to me is more so akin to the overdrive from Ableton. The dual pan is kind of like the auto pan from Ableton as well, but it has a separation of the left and right channel, so they act independently as opposed to everything moving as one. So you can use these to flip the phase of something if you need to, which is kind of neat. But on the same case, if you want everything to kind of auto pan in the way that we're used to, then what you would do is you'd automate these together. Because right now it's on the left, and so you can kind of pull these from one to the other. If you have these opposite and moving in between, then you just get phase polarity, which doesn't really do a whole lot other than mess your signal up. So the panning behavior of these two basically means that this will try to keep a consistent volume in between, or it will just try to keep everything smooth. And so I think that if the gain is equal, it will actually introduce a lot more amplitude differences. But if you keep it as a hybrid, I think that it will try to keep everything on a constant volume. So that's a little bit confusing, but yeah, still pretty neat. So this is your main source of sidechaining if you're used to doing it in conventional ways. And the difference between this and like a regular compressor is that you have a low and you have a high, which is dictated right here, but it's also a downwards and upwards compressor. So that means that you can basically push a signal pretty hard if you do it right or do it wrong. So if you need to sidechain something, you just find your input here, which takes an audio signal. And what you can set this to is you turn the ratio up and then you start pumping some of this stuff up. And you'll see that with this upwards curve now, you're going to get more amplitude. And there's a ton of distortion that you're getting from that now. Unlike all the other compressors and stuff, there's no makeup gain, there's no soft clipping, there's nothing other than that. So this is a little bit difficult to control, but once you get used to it, it's not to say that it's not serviceable. There's also this sidechain effects thing that you can have as well, so that can be something that's interesting if you want everything to be affected by that too. But basically, if you turn the ratio up on the low and then you turn the ratio down, then you're going to get more sound, but really you can just kind of use this curve as a guide. Oh, that's cool. You can also manipulate the curve here as well if you want to. Yeah, so if you stack these, then you're going to get some really interesting sounds. So you can actually use your dynamics as another means of distortion if you want, which can be kind of cool. Okay, so this EQ is relatively simple. It's just a low and a high. We have 4 different algorithms or 4 different shapes, curves, however you want to describe that as. And basically you can kind of just move this around. And so like normally this isn't like the best EQ to do something like surgical with, but you can actually use this as a means of like a custom filter or something if you want it to be. So if you have a low pass on this, or maybe you want like a softer curve, then you can create an amalgamated sort of bandpass filter, but it's pretty simple other than that. It's just your standard things. And you can also turn one or the other off if you just want to use a regular thing, but honestly I find that using the filter in itself is a little bit easier for me to work with. So the EQ5 is cool. It's kind of strange that you can only pick between certain band types over on all these as opposed to having access to all of them. I know why they did that, just to kind of keep things relatively organized, but honestly, like if I wanted to turn all of these off and then just use one or the other as like a low or high, then that would have been nice. But some cool things about this is that aside from having this here, if you turn all of these on and you have a specific filter shape, then one thing that they introduced that it's really fun to do is you can use this as a shift, and you can't see it, but you'll be able to hear it. So if you want to create vocal filter shapes with this, then there's a great incentive to kind of do so. And for more fun, you can actually automate everything. And one thing I appreciate too that I don't see in many other stock EQs is that you actually have a mix on here. And why this is important is because sometimes you want the sound to come in super clean. So like Ableton's EQ doesn't actually have a mix function on it. You would have to do something like a chain or whatever. But now that you have this, you can have this moving around and then go back to the original signal. So this is actually a really awesome means for doing some kind of interesting movement, as you can tell. This is like a typical like old school Skrillex type of introduction to monster basses and all that. So try that one out for sure. So this is kind of interesting too, because you basically have a low pass, mid band, and a high pass. And this is basically a frequency separation, but it only outputs to a single signal. So if you want to do some mixing or something, this is kind of what you would use, you know? So think of this as like you're going to turn the lows down and then introduce another tune and then introduce that, which I guess like has its use. And you can also automate the bands, I guess, which is kind of cool. So if you're feeling super lazy, you can actually automate these crossovers, which doesn't really seem to be doing a whole lot, but if you boost the mid, you can get some subtle stuff, but just know that this is typically for mixing. So if you're going to put a DJ set onto like the grid, or sorry, onto like the clip launcher or something, which is a typical way that a lot of people actually do DJing, that's what you would use this for. But as far as I know, it doesn't really have a whole lot of creative mixes compared to the filter and all the other stuff. So the filter itself is definitely serviceable. I use this quite a bit actually. It's a shame that I can't see the bands on here, but it's at least neat that you do have an XY pad of sorts. It makes things a little bit easier to kind of, or a little bit more tactile. So you have 7 different filter types minus this one, which what's the point of this one, but okay. You have a pre and post gain. You can think of this kind of like as a drive, although it's only one particular filter, or sorry, like circuitry type, which I don't think that it describes what it is, but just its volume. But it is nice that you can give this a means of extra volume if you don't want to like add another means of distortion on top of that. So I think that like this notch right here is actually only a bell curve as opposed to like a band reject. So I don't think that it actually cuts the signal down here. I think it's just a dip. Yeah, I think that it would be cutting more frequencies if it were, even within... Yeah, so just keep that in mind. But it is really nice to put an LFO or a randomizer, or if you guys have seen any of my bass videos or something, then you can kind of move along with that, and it's, yeah, it works. One other cool thing that you can kind of cheat, although it's going to create, like, it's not going to be smooth, is that you can actually add a randomizer or an LFO to modulate between the filter types, but each time you do it, it's going to give you a click in the sound. So just a quick example of that, if you pull up a random and you place it like this, then you'll see that this is going to move between each filter type. Which can be great for some randomization, but at the same time, and it can also be an LFO and stuff too, but unfortunately, like, it doesn't have a smooth transition between these, which would have been super awesome. That would have been really nice. Even if you set this to a smooth, it's still going to have that same kind of clicky nature. So just keep that in mind. But the filter is cool. It definitely has a place within my own personal use. All right, so the flanger is actually really awesome. This is one of the better effects of Bitwig for sure. So you have a positive and negative feedback on this. And when you kind of pull back on this a little bit and then introduce the time, turn up the LFO, I actually like that it has much more of a predictable like jet sound as a flanger. To me, that's what a flanger should sound like. There's this like opposite or like negative feedback on Ableton's flanger that it makes it difficult to get sounds like this. I think that it was serving a different purpose. And a flanger is basically just a particular comb filter shape anyways, but at the same time, I'm a big fan of this. It works really well. So if you want to do some of those like classic Reese's and stuff, like with the detune thing or something, then you can definitely... maybe with a little bit of wideness that could end up becoming super cool. But yeah, it definitely is a lot more predictable, and I actually really enjoy the flanger itself. The frequency shifter is cool if you like that typical effect. It's something that I do on basses pretty often, and it basically just kind of gives you that warping sound. If you set the mix to full and you shift, but if you turn the range up and then move this, then you can get some more results. This is really cool if you want to do like kind of, it's not necessarily ring mod, but it will definitely give you some offset stuff that will give you some interesting effects, but also be careful because that was really high pitched. So The effects grid we'll talk about in another video because that deserves its own thing. So just kind of keep that in mind. Now the effects layer is a container that you can basically stack effects to in a chain, and this is actually really fun because if you start putting stuff into it, then you can kind of do like a selection between all of these, which is something I've been doing lately on my streams. So if you're interested in that, go check out some of those VODs, but just think of it as like an effect group or an audio effect rack. The effects selector, however, kind of gives you an option to kind of alternate between all of these. If you go into here and you add some of these like this, and you just kind of pop some things in. Okay, come on. Then you can basically select between these. And there is a way that you can, yeah, there we go. So you can map this to where you can have a dial on this to kind of select between all of these, which is pretty neat, but it's pretty fun to kind of set this to something and then have different selections between the two. This is basically a standard gate. You have a threshold, a depth, and attack and release. You also have sidechain effects that you can apply this to, and you can do a frozen tab, which is kind of, and basically like all other things, you just set the device input and then it's pretty standard other than that. I wish that there was a way that you can kind of flip this and have a little bit more options, but as a standard gate, then, you know, it's not too special. So the hardware stuff I can't really talk about because I don't have hardware. I would consult the manual for that. I'm so sorry if that is why you watch this video, but I'm going to be honest, like that's just not my cup of tea and I don't own anything. So you guys can kind of look at that on the actual manual. Next up, we'll move on to the ladder filter. And this is pretty cool because you have a device input that you can set this to kind of like as an envelope follower. And you basically have a bunch of different, like this is the most robust amount of filter types that you can choose from. And you can kind of turn all these parameters and set the gain. And then the actual envelope follower would be right here. So it's kind of neat actually. Set this to retrigger. Let me set this to something more. And so there's a lot of different options that you can do with this to create a complex filter type movement, but honestly, I'd much rather just draw in automation than use a ladder filter. It's not to say that you shouldn't or can't do it though, but it's kind of neat. So this is an effect container of sorts. If you see like anything that's a white icon, that it means that it's a container. And basically this is a mid-side split, so you can put mid effects onto this and then you can put side effects onto this. So this is actually a really interesting way to signal split for things like bass and super saws and really anything, but it's cool that you actually have this kind of control to apply that to your stereo field. So on the effect stacks from these two, you have a low and a high, and you can change the crossover and also the gain between the two. I have my default one set up to here, and basically on the low I have a mono tool, and then on the high it's just kind of clean, but that's a default preset that I have saved. And then on the multiband FX3, this is actually kind of like the DJ filter, except now you actually have parallel signal between all of these. And my default preset is I have a high pass filter on the lows that's being randomized. I have a band pass that is kind of also being randomized in the low mids, and then I have a low pass that's kind of modulating the highs. And this is just like my typical multi-band filter for different kinds of neuro bass and stuff. But it's cool that you have different choices to automate the crossover. You can create like your own custom quote unquote OTT if you wanted to, but you can throw any effects that you want to on here, but that's just kind of the typical thing that I use this for. So if you're into neuro processing, this is like one of your best friends. So the oscilloscope is awesome. You have a lot of different ways to look at your stereo signal or your audio signal through this, and it's become an essential tool for me, especially when designing transients and all that. But if you take a look at this, then this doesn't look that interesting. But if you scale this up a little bit more, then you can actually start to see the waveform. And if you hit this, then you can actually see and kind of pause what it is that you're looking at. On the scale, this will actually tell you on a deeper sense of what's happening within the waveform. And then there's different triggers that you can activate within this. So this one is a note trigger. This one is just play. So if you hit play, nothing's recorded, but you can do it that way. I typically hold on this and set a long hold time, and that way I can kind of take a look at what I'm doing. And if I need to zoom out, then I can basically view all that in such a way. So yeah, the oscilloscope is an essential tool. Everybody should use one. The peak limiter is essentially just a limiter, but it's basically trying to tame the peaks as opposed to your RMS. So you set a ceiling that it won't go past, and then you can push the input volume, and then it has a release time. It's kind of strange that there's no attack though, but maybe that's because it's a peak limiter, but who knows. But yeah, it's typically something that you can set on your master channel if you want to keep yourself from, getting peaks and stuff, but it's pretty simple other than that. Phaser's dope. It's a lot of fun. It's kind of strange how this is set up because it's using an external LFO to automate the frequencies, so this is meant to be static, but you can kind of change the frequency offset between the left and the right fields to create some really interesting movement. And then you have a high pass filter, which I think is what the core should have had. You have your pull options, but it sounds great. So other than that, it's pretty standard, but again, this is something that it sounds the way that I would expect a phaser to, and that's something that I can actually appreciate. So yeah, you can change the speed of the LFO via here. I have to close out of this. Okay, yeah, I have to close out of this tab in order to access that, but that's where you can set the LFO speed. It's kind of odd that that's the way that that's set up, but okay, it works. So next up we have the pitch shifter. This is pretty much your typical which is kind of cool, actually. You can do a lot of interesting things with this. I typically lean to the kilohertz one more so, but it's not to say that this doesn't serve its purpose. It's a shame that you can only go up or down an octave. But if you use like a ton of these in succession, then you can undo. Then you can actually create some like crazy artifacts with this. So So there's a lot of like room for play in that if you insert multiple sources of different things, and that's just a quick example, but I would definitely like play with that a bit. So essentially what the replacer is, if it takes the input of a particular frequency and key, and you replace that frequency with this sound. So right now I have it set to an F3, and this is like a much higher pitch version of this, but when the threshold is low enough, then instead of using the original sound, it will replace it with the new sound. But the problem, or the thing to keep in mind, is that whenever this hits, it will only play this key, so it acts as a MIDI response too, which is neat. I haven't really thought about doing things in that way, but as you can see, it will. It's almost like a custom resonator, I think is a good way to place this. So if you want to have a resonator with a specific sound on top of this, but it's always going to play a constant note, then you can choose whatever sound you want to put into this and then send that within that. That's kind of cool. I never really messed with that, but that's good to know. I would have just called it like custom resonator or something, but it is what it is. The resonator bank is like 6 different resonators that you can use to shift and play with. And to me, this isn't really so much of getting tonalities, unless if you set each one to a specific hertz function that is there, which you can do. It'll tell you what key it's in up here, but basically you can also use this as like a vocoder in some sense. You can also set this to key tracking, which is kind of cool, but each one can be individually moved to whatever frequency you want, and then you can also automate the resonances of all these, and then also the volume or just the overall gain. And then over here you have a global, so this would be all of the frequencies of this. This would be all of the resonances. And this would be the gain. But yeah, some different interesting things within this. It's a huge multi-resonator that can be, it's not really my kind of thing, but it's not to say that you shouldn't try it out for yourself. So next up we have the reverb. And the reverb is really cool because you have these individual bands that you can separate between all of these. You have your tank effects, and you also have a wet effects group that you can send this through, and then you also have a width function, so you can just turn that up all the way. And I'm just kidding. But there's a lot of different options that you have with this. You have a pre-delay, and then you also have a size, and then 2 different options for your early reflections, which is a room and a hall. But you also have a late mix on this, and there's a lot of customization within this. So typically I'll turn this up all the way, and then you have like a decay on, you have like an overall decay, and then you have how much, I guess, like multiplication. Oh, it's called a low band reverb factor on this. So if you turn down the lows right here and you pump this up, then it should have a longer decay on the high end. If you turn the late mix down, that's like the overall decay. But it's kind of cool that you can create like a smaller room without the late mix. And then if you turn the build up down, then you can create some interesting effects with this. And I would also encourage you to go and look at some of the presets on here because some of them sound pretty nice. So yeah, the reverb is definitely a plus in my book on this one. So the ring mod's awesome. You can have a different source for a sound that you want to ring mod this to if you want it to be custom, but this is a really good way to introduce some extra character to some of your sounds, or to also just create and generate some like strange effects. You also have a pre and post, so there's a lot that you can do with this. So if you like doing that, especially with like basses and stuff, you know, which is a typical thing of going like, there's a lot of different ways to achieve that, like with an auto pan or whatever, but with that you can create some really interesting results. But just know that that's achievable via that. So the rotary is kind of moves everything around the stereo fields in a way, and you can kind of see that in some ways it's also serves like as an auto pan, which I guess if you wanted to, one thing that you could do is you can set a tool to mono if you wanted to control it in that way, but this will kind of just fluctuate between the left and right channels. So this is one way that you can add some space, but typically you're going to lose your mid signal because it's constantly moving, but that's not to say that it's not like a neat thing to try. So the analyzer is, you know, your typical representation. You have a fall off rate that you can make this into like kind of freeze, or you can kind of set this to be super duper reactive. But this is typically what you would use if you're just trying to view, you know, like what's happening within your signal. I like to use the oscilloscope instead of the frequency range, but this is something that you can throw on your master channel and kind of look at. I don't think that's quite as good as something like Vox Syngo Span, but if you don't feel like downloading that because it's free, then it's definitely serviceable. So your stereo split is kind of like your mid-side split, except it separates between your left and right channel. So sometimes it's kind of interesting to apply different distortions and different like effects on each side depending on what your sound is. But just think of this as like a chain split for your left and right signal. Test tone, that's all it is. It's just a sine wave. So if you want to do something interesting with that and record that out, then it definitely means that you can do something with a glitch. So the time shift is is Bitwig's answer to track delays. You can't really, if you set something before, it won't really work, but if you want to create swing on something, then alright, so you can see the midis here. If you time shift this super far, then according to your host tempo, it will kind of move it will kind of offset everything. So it's unfortunate that you can't push it early because it just won't work, but it is kind of cool that you can push everything a little bit late if you need to use that. The tool is like a utility, left and right phase channels, you can swap them, you can automate the amplitude, the panning position, and then also the stereo width of something. Bass mono would be nice, I'm used to that, but the stereo or frequency split on that makes it pretty easy to kind of do that yourself, so it's not that big of a deal. The transient shaper, boy, is this one of the coolest things about Bitwig. Okay, so typically it's just your standard transient shaper of like, you can push your attack and then the time of the attack up or whatever, and then also your gain and the time of the sustain. Sorry, the time of the sustain and the gain of the sustain. You have a choice between a peak and RMS, but the real magic of this is that you can set this, you can apply any effect to this, and you can have, oh, that's ugly. You can have your attack or sustain automate any parameter that's within this. So this is going to get really loud during the attack, and then it's going to turn down. If I grab the sustain and I turn, let's see what's on here, something like this on, then this is a really awesome way to create like big, wide open snares and pull them down with a reverb or something. Polarity already has a video on this, but there's a lot of options that you can do with this aside from it just being a really good transient control in general. So go check that out. So the Tree Monster is basically a sine wave generator, and it introduces a lot of movement that you can apply. It's kind of strange in behavior, and you're going to have to fiddle with it a bit, but it reminds me of like a bird generator in some cases and whatnot, but just listen to how it sounds. Woo! It's actually pretty cool. So you have a ring blend. Yeah, it's kind of a fun way to do some additive synth or something of that nature, to just add a sine wave on top of this, and this can be fun to play with as an effect, but that's basically what it does, is it just adds a sine harmonic, or actually a sine wave, and has like a pitch envelope, and then the speed is the time that it will take to get to the optimal amplitude, and then the ring is just a ring modulation. If you want to generate like computer sounds for games or something, that's a great way to try to apply that. So the tremolo is like the shortcut version of how you would auto pan filter something. So you can set the depth to 100%, and this is kind of like, I've done this trick with the ring mod, but except on this you have different algorithms that you can choose from to create that movement. So that's a really awesome way that you can introduce something like that, and it's super duper fun. The random stuff, if you want to just generate some randomness, is pretty fun too. And then you can also set the retrigger on here, but that's pretty self-explanatory. So this is the vocoder. It's the newest addition to the Bitwig effects, and in my opinion, it sounds just as good as like FL Studio's vocodex. There's some things that you kind of have to get used to with this, but it's not to say that it's not powerful. Over on the left, you have the modulator, so you can change the formant, you can change the brightness of this. You can also change between mono and stereo, where you can also manipulate the bands. I usually have mine set at 80. And pull this up a bit. But this is a great way to add some kind of vocal movement to your stuff. And then like when you get into starting to modulate some of this stuff, it can sound pretty nice. This is the floor. I usually have it set to full range, so this is kind of like your amplitude that you can set this between. So the lower it goes, it's only going to affect that amplitude. But I typically like having everything full range. This is your low crossover and your high crossover. Again, full range. 80 bands. To me, I find that I like using that the most. You also have your bandpass type, so you can use a wide bandpass or a 4-pole. I have the most thing with this. But one cool thing that you can do with this as well is you can set this to freeze. And so it will try to continue the sound and let that ring out. You can also have an attack and release on this. And then you can also change the carrier settings onto this. Right now it's set to brown noise, but you can kind of pull this up and go into almost anything, really. If you pull a grid up and you go into something even like this, I don't think it really matters, but it will change the sound that goes into this. So That's actually pretty sick. So you can create some really interesting textures with that. And the carrier can be anything that you want, but having some different choices like that can potentially be super interesting to you. I typically just use the noise, but yeah, I kind of feel like vocoder deserves its own video, but in a nutshell, that's basically what we're looking at. So you can also set different modulators to this if you want, which is kind of like a before and after, but the carrier thing is pretty sick. And then you also have wet effects, so there's a ton of stuff that you can do with all of this. I just kind of encourage you guys to experiment. But as far as the audio effects goes, that's pretty much all that there is. I try to give a brief explanation of kind of how I would use every single one or my thoughts on them a little bit more in depth then. But yeah, that's pretty much it for episode 1. The next episode we'll be looking at all the MIDI effects, and there's a lot to talk about on those. So I kind of just wanted to bring everything into a single video just to keep it cohesive and have a lot more content to kind of look at. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you guys in the next episode, which will be the MIDI effects.